Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our penultimate webinar of the afternoon. Delighted to be joined by this one by Ruth Waring, I'll let her introduce herself in a little bit, and then she'll take you through why she's going to take us through this session. Just for those of you that have been with us, apologies, you're going to hear me say the same spiel again as I've done previously. This session is being recorded and it will be made available on the Risk Evolves YouTube channel and then the Risk Evolves website as well at the beginning of next week. If you have any questions, please put them into the chat box. Ruth likes to have lots of questions on any topic related to health and safety. And if you have any other chat or any other feedback, if you have any technical problems with the GoToWebinar, then please just pop those into the chat as well, and Dean will endeavour to help you. When we close the call, you will be asked a couple of short questions as part of a feedback questionnaire. Please just fill them in. We like feedback. We're interested to hear any feedback. Clearly, we'd obviously like good feedback, but if you've got any hints and tips on what we can do in the future, how we can improve this, or indeed any future sessions that you'd like to see from us, then please let us know. So, Ruth, I shall hand over to you in terms of driving at work. If I move the slides forward, that would probably help. Do you want to just give a bit of background on who you are?
Absolutely, yeah. Hello everybody, good afternoon. My name's Ruth Waring. I'm a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport, and I've been working in the logistics profession since 1989. I specialise in compliance, particularly for those driving on the public highway, so driving on the road, as we would call it, and also those vehicles that are moving off the public highway. So in terms of driving, that splits into two different types of risk. So we would have the risk associated with speed, distraction and other vehicles on the public highway. And then we have different risks associated with vehicles moving off the public highway. So for example, we might find that we've got forklifts or quarry vehicles or lorries and pedestrians moving in the same areas off the public highway has got different types of risks. So interestingly, as it says on the slide, driving at work is one of the most dangerous things that we all do, and yet we tend to completely underplay the specific risk that this poses to us. The reason for that is that we do it in our private lives. So we think that something that we do every day, it's a bit like somebody doing a risk assessment for a drill. You think, well, I use the drill at home, so why is this then more dangerous than what I do at home? And yet, of course, the statistics show that we have quite significant risks of death on the public highway. So it's also important to remember that we, as employers, we have a legal obligation under the Health and Safety at Work Act to look after employee safety and those affected by our activities. So when we're driving for work, obviously we're not just looking at our own staff, whether that's lorry drivers, people driving to the post office, somebody driving to a sales meeting, somebody going to do a supplier audit, somebody driving a van. All of those things are driving for work. And as we can see here, we've got 22 people killed every minute or injured on the public highway, 60 serious injuries every day, 24% of road deaths are pedestrians, and about 5 people are killed every day. So that's the statistics are coming from Brake, which is one of the main road safety charities, which is actually quite heavily involved with safety of lorries and the impact of lorries on the public highway. And it was founded by a lady whose father was killed by a lorry. So that's one of the things that they work very closely with the industry that I'm directly involved with as well. So I think it's important to bear in mind that although it's not sector specific necessarily, the risks posed by people driving for your business during the working day are the ones that tend to get overlooked. And as we'll go on through the webinar, we'll explain how you can look at controlling those risks. Yeah. So if you are thinking about doing a risk assessment for working on the public highway, we've got to really think about the risks of what we call an RTC. These used to be referred to as RTAs, road traffic accidents, but terminology has changed because the word accident has the idea within it that somehow no one's at fault. And we're always trying to get through the idea that there is always something that could have been prevented. And a road traffic collision or road traffic crash is more of a statement of fact. That's what actually happened. So in terms of the mitigation that we as people running the business need to look at is, have we got a driving at work policy? Now, driving at work policy is fairly all-encompassing and covers a lot of different areas. So it would look at, for example, whether or not we do checks of people's driving licenses, and unsurprisingly, it tends to be an area that somebody always thinks somebody else is doing. So the operation staff think that HR check licenses. HR maybe only do it as part of a personal data check. So they might check your driving license, but only to check your address is correct. Is anybody looking at the back of your license? Are people looking at how many points you've got? Is that license check done on a regular basis? All of these things, if there's no policy, the chances are it's not being checked, or it may be being done in a very ad hoc kind of way. And again, those who are checking lorry drivers tend to be, this is a higher priority, but van drivers, salespeople, and anybody who drives grey fleet. Now, some of you may not have heard of the expression grey fleet before, but it's basically people who drive their own cars, usually it's cars, on company business. And it may be that it's only once in a blue moon, and therefore it doesn't come under anybody's top of anybody's list. But if you've got somebody that visits, say, the post office once a week to put money in the bank, or you've got somebody that taxes vehicles once a quarter, or you've got somebody that goes to a client meeting, if they're not driving a company car or a hire car, then they're probably driving their own car. And at that point, we need to check that their license is correct, that they've got the correct class, which is B if you're driving a car or van, or it's C1 or C or C plus C if you're driving a vehicle at 7.5 tons, a bigger rigid vehicle, or an Arctic. So we've got all of these things to do with license checks, which are quite often just not something that anybody really thinks about, or as I've said, can fall between all of those stools of, oh, I thought HR did it, and then actually nobody's doing it. And there are great pieces of software out there now.
I've just done this. I've actually done those vehicle checks as well, those license checks for my team, and I use the DVLA portal where the individual registers, and it gives you a code to put into the system. Really easy to do, because the DVLA portal now even PDFs that evidence, doesn't it, about the number of points that somebody may have, qualifications they may have.
It's really good. Yeah,
dead easy to do. I was amazed.
And best of all, it's free.
And it's free. I was just going to say it's completely free.
So don't worry about spending lots of money. If you're running a more professional, if you're employing professional drivers, you might want to look at a bureau, a license checking bureau, which will do more regular checks. Drivers sign a mandate, and then they are checked once a quarter, or whatever you set the frequency to be, and then you can be more proactive in looking for problems. If you're managing workers who are doing car driving, then the DVLA portal is brilliant, and they can give you a code. It's all okay from a GDPR perspective, and yeah, thanks Helen, it's a really useful thing to know about.
It took me, and no word of a lie, it took me 10 minutes per member of staff, if that, and most of that was because I was working quite slowly, and yeah, just trying to make sure I got all the data in the same place. So yeah, really easy to do. Really
good, and as Helen says, maybe not something that you would ever know about if you weren't working in that particular sector. So definitely worth just put in DVLA driver license check, and it will come up. So drugs and alcohol policy, what is your policy? Are you actually potentially testing people if they've been involved in an RTC, or even if they've been involved in something more minor? Are you actually testing potentially whether they've got drugs and alcohol in their system? Make sure that you've got content, so staff handbook for car drivers. Again, don't forget Grey Fleet is part of this. Even if it's a section of your existing handbook, make sure it's clear on what insurance they need. If it's Grey Fleet, then they'll need business use, which some people might say, well, I'm not paying extra for that, and that can get a bit embroiled. And then, how do you overcome that? But if you've never actually challenged them, they probably haven't got business insurance, making sure that they're a member of a recovery organisation if they have a breakdown, that they've basically thought about this and they've got taxed MOT and insured car, and that you are checking that properly. That is part of the greyfruit policy. Also have a policy on things like how many hours it's okay for people to drive. Are you expecting people to drive for 2 or 3 hours to a client before their 8-hour working day? Driving 3 hours back, that makes a very long working day. So don't forget about driving as being part of the working day, and have a policy on, you know, when you'd expect people to use public transport, when you'd expect people to fly. All of these things, if somebody were to have a road traffic collision or a serious incident, it could come back to the employer to say, why weren't you managing that person's working time more assiduously? It's a really important point. So license checks we've talked about, age criteria, check what your insurance is prepared to accept. Nowadays, particularly with lorry drivers and van drivers, we've got a major shortage, as you probably know. So insurers have been kind of forced to, along the road of having to accept greater risk. The way that they tend to do this risk and share this risk is to actually put more on the excess for that driver. So I have to, for example, maintain an Excel spreadsheet with the names of the drivers, their age, whether they're novice drivers, whether they're under the age of 23. I have to advise on what work they're doing. They will accept those drivers as a risk. They know that for this industry to keep going, we have to have novice drivers who may have only passed their test fairly recently, whereas in the past it used to be 2 years experience, which was always a very hard catch-22 situation for drivers to get through. So make sure that you have a clear policy on what your insurance will and won't accept, and points. Check the points on your staff license. Make sure it's in the handbook or it's in your terms and conditions, that they must tell you if they've got points added or if they're expecting to have a driving ban. That can help you plan as well. But obviously it's something that people might feel very embarrassed about. So it's really important that you mandate that they must tell you. Insurance we've talked about a bit, but make sure it's clear with your insurance broker or your fleet insurance exactly what it is that you are actually paying for. Make sure that you're communicating with them. Much better to tell them something they don't need to know than not tell them something they do need to know. And then if you are driving, if you've got lorries and vans, make sure you're aware of the working time directive. Working time directive for mobile workers, which is those who are driving on a tacho, that tends to be staff driving over 3.5 ton vehicles. That is where you need to be into the working time directive and EU drivers hours. You will know what those are if you've got lorry drivers working for you, but working time directive also applies for van drivers, salespeople, everybody else, and that's working time directive for non-mobile workers. And everybody needs to be aware of that. And driving time, if they're driving to work, which is somewhere, for example, going to a meeting that's not your normal place of work, that counts as working time. So be mindful of how much time you're actually asking people to work, especially those kind of people who are doing an 8-hour day in between. Make sure that what you're asking them to do isn't basically unrealistic and could potentially be seen as dangerous if you actually put those hours up in a court of law. Well, they had to set off at 5 o'clock in the morning to get to Scotland. They weren't going to get back till 9 o'clock at night. They'd done a full 8-hour day in between, and they had a crash in the last 20 minutes on the way home. Was it actually okay for you to expect them to do that? And often people who do a lot of traveling can be very tired towards the end of the week. So look at fitness to drive and driver fatigue. And if you're not aware of the risks already of sleep apnea, then please do find out more about sleep apnea, because it can affect drivers quite badly. It's a sleeping disorder which can have a major knock-on effect on your ability to stay awake at the wheel. So be aware of that. I'm conscious of time, so we'll move on to vehicles breaking down. There's a major risk if you break down at the roadside or on the motorway. Obviously, you can have cars driving into the back of you. You can also have the risk of, if anybody's ever got out of a car on the motorway, you're suddenly aware of how incredibly fast those cars are going. Make it clear in your handbook what you expect staff to do in the event of a breakdown. Toolbox talks are good. toolbox talks don't have to be done in a face-to-face. It can be done on Teams. You can send out information to people. Make it clear about what your mobile phone policy is. The laws are getting ever more draconian, as you probably know, on mobile phone use. Make sure people have got contact numbers and that they've got the use of a breakdown recovery service. And it's important to remember things like lone females will be prioritised. There's also some good guidance from the hard shoulder safety group about how to stay safe on the hard shoulder, getting out of the car on the passenger side, for example, so you're not going straight into the flow of traffic, putting out a warning triangle, waiting on the other side of the fence. All of this is good basic information which could stop your staff getting mown down on the hard shoulder, which is a very dangerous place to be.
Brilliant, Ruth,
okay,
thank you.
I go now on to the
off-highway. Yeah. So I got these numbers from HSE last night. And obviously this was the fatal accidents that occurred in the pandemic year as well. So sadly, these are lower than they normally are, which I think is quite sad.
Yeah, so it's being struck by a moving vehicle, struck by a moving object is unfortunately quite a high incidence. People fall from heights, so it's not just car transporters, which is the world that I work in, but people can fall from quite a low height. Actually, it can be people, for example, falling from the catwalk on the back of the lorry, people falling from the unit or just the cab itself. Obviously, you've got to climb up into the cab, so you're working at height. Being struck by another vehicle could be a forklift truck, could be another goods vehicle, could be a van. All of these things are risks that maybe off the public highway people don't think about. So the classic one for lorry drivers is runaways and driveaways. Runaways are which can happen to any vehicle, van drivers and car drivers, but it's worse if it's a lorry. So usually when the handbrake's been left off and the vehicle starts moving, so the driver is potentially on the catwalk, instead of disconnecting the airline, which is what happens if you're coupling up a unit and trailer, the driver tends to try and run around and use their hand on the foot brake, which unfortunately can then result in them being crushed or being run over by their own lorry, because obviously it then gets momentum as the vehicle starts to move. So unfortunately, drivers being run over by their own lorry is fairly more common, unfortunately more common than you would actually want it to be. We also have the risk of drive-away, which is when the driver's on a bay or they've got a curtain-sided vehicle and somebody's on the back of the vehicle unloading them, maybe on a forklift truck or a pallet truck or even a pedestrian. They start to move away because they think that they're safe to go, and either the traffic lights are faulty or somebody's just forgotten to load something and they've opened the door at the last minute to shove something on. The driver's already been told to go. Number of people that fall down that gap is quite significant. So it's those sort of things. It's thinking through the risks around deliveries and collections at your premises, and critically it may not be that these are even your vehicles. So but think about the outside, think about your yard, think about the metaphorical and physical gap between the lorry drivers and your building, and think about what the risks are to the people who are actually making deliveries and collections at your premises. Just because they're not working for you doesn't mean that they're not your responsibility, because on your site they are your responsibility. You will always have vicarious responsibility for those in your site. So the risk assessment, these are just two examples of things. You know, this is a massive subject and I've only got a very short time to go through it. I'm just trying to give you a taster really of some of the things to think about. But if the hazard is goods vehicles manoeuvring in areas where pedestrians walk and forklift trucks operate, we're looking at crush injury. The first thing, if we go to the hierarchy of risk reduction, some of you will be aware of, eliminate the risk. Don't have pedestrians in the area. So don't have admin staff walking around, don't have people walking around in flip-flops, clogs. If you don't need to be there, eliminate them. Use radios to communicate, use mobile phones to communicate. Don't ask people to walk up to drivers who don't need to be in the yard. Think about signage, it's really important. Think about using pictograms, because you might have people that don't speak English. Have safe systems of work. information for visiting drivers, have a clear drug and alcohol policy, including testing for cause for forklift truck and large goods vehicle drivers. And then finally, we spoke about this already, goods vehicles pulling off a loading bay, crush injury from the person loading the vehicle, falling between the gap as the vehicle pulls away. So interlock devices, there are things like salvo systems where you can lock the coupling, the vehicle coupling system, and then the key is removed and then goes up in the air with the loading bay, so you can't actually access the coupling mechanism, so you can't couple up and drive away. Have the driver sitting in the passenger seat so they can't inadvertently drive away. Traffic lights, key controls. If you work in this area, you'll already be aware of this, but again, you may not think about it. If this is something where you've got perhaps van drivers coming and going, is there a risk of your staff being potentially run over by somebody while they're, or coming out the back of a van because the van driver thinks they can go? So all of these things, a lot of it's about communication, but making sure that communication is embedded as business as usual, so you can't have the risk from the hazard of somebody actually driving away and therefore causing potentially a fatal injury.
That's brilliant, Ruth. It's such a complicated, well, I guess it's a complicated area, but actually in other ways it's a really, really simple, straightforward area, isn't it? It's common sense. A lot of this is common sense around thinking about what the risk and the negative, what may happen if you don't do X, Y, Z. I don't know whether we've got any questions coming in, but I know Ruth is always around if anybody wants to raise any questions. I think for me, the area on grey fleet is something that is so frequently overlooked. You know, I run a professional services business. People go out and visit customers. We have absolutely got the right controls in place now because that's being done with your help and support, but how many other companies are working out there where their employees may just go somewhere to see a customer or go to a conference or whatever, and they're using, as you rightly say, their own vehicle for work and haven't given that next step consideration. Similarly, if you're running a company where you may have delivery drivers or security drivers or all sorts of things where driving is a part of their role but not necessarily the whole part of their role. So lots to think about and to consider. I don't know whether anybody's got any questions, any thoughts, any feedback for Ruth? No, very quiet audience today, Ruth, very quiet. But, if not, that's been brilliant. I will give you some time back then, Ruth. Thanks ever so much for taking the time to take us through driving safely at work. Hopefully everybody has enjoyed the session. Please provide us with some feedback and we look forward to seeing you on the next one. Thanks, Ruth.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.